Professor Casanova, it is a great pleasure for us to have you here at Yale and to participate in this interview with us. Many of us here around the globe have appreciated very much both the extent of your work and the depth of your understanding of the social phenomena, in particular phenomenon of religion. For many today, it still seems that expectation that in the course of modernity, religions will decline, both in terms of their social influence and in terms of individual practice. That's almost like a given expectation. You have been one of the early detractors of the so-called secularization thesis. Why?
Well, I guess the background is I come from Europe, and in Europe I took this thesis for granted. And I came to the United States, and it took me a very long time to understand why a modern secular society like the United States could be so religious. And of course you can say, well, this is the exception to the rule, but the rule still holds. But then you realize this is not a very good answer. And then the more you look around the world, you realize that you have a lot of these countries which are modernizing, but doesn't mean that their religions are declining. On the contrary, religion becomes for the first time a key contested, a centrally contested issue in the process of political democratization, mobilization. So I think that it forced me to rethink the paradigms of secularization, which are at the center of my own discipline, sociology.
And you don't take these, what some described as resurgence of religion as we look around the globe, you don't take those to be something like a last gasp of religion before the onslaught of modernity, which will from within kind of undermine and render redundant religious convictions and role of religion in society. Why?
Well, because we're still caught in the old model. There was religion in the past before modernity, then comes secular modernity and makes religion precisely irrelevant. And then so you have this last gap of anti-modern, anti-secular reaction, which we call fundamentalism. I think that only if you presuppose that modernization means secularization in the sense in which religion, the old religion disappears, but modernization itself radically transforms all religions. And there is a sense in which what we call Western secularization is so intrinsically related to process of the transformation of Western Christianity. These processes are so interrelated that the very clear separation of the boundaries of the secular and the religious is very problematic. Again, here, I think the United States is a very clear sense. The French model, which is the kind of laic model, anti-clerical model, is to precisely clearly differentiate the spheres, keep the boundaries very clear, and make religion ever smaller and marginalized. The Protestant, and to a certain extent the American model, is actually you dissolve the boundaries. And religion is supposed to become secular, and the secular become religious, and you never know where religion begins and the secular ends. If you take this model, then it means that modernization means not so much, this secularization minus religion, that religion disappears, but a radical transformation of the relation between this thing that we call religion and the secular, which of course is a very Christian way of looking at these matters, and for other religions these boundaries did not exist. So the question is, how are the boundaries remade, redefined? And so it's a question more of analyzing transformations going on at all levels, rather than thinking of these separate processes.
If we step back for a moment from a kind of Western setting and the certain conjunction between Western religious as well as political and economic traditions and what have been described as secularization processes, one might speak, as some people have done, and I know that you have as well done, of kind of multiple modernities, only one of which might be, one version of modernity might be a secularizing one. Would you care to explain a bit the concept of these multiple modernities?
This is the most interesting, one of the most interesting kind of intellectual analytical frameworks being developed now, linking history, social science, philosophy. the category is linked to the axial revolutions thesis. Jaspers was the one that developed the notion that there was a fundamentally axial revolution that gave birth to the great civilizations as we know them, and radically is understood as the emergence of a principle of transcendence, a separation between reality as we know it, especially political power, and the possibility of a transcendent principle with which to judge, evaluate this world. And of course, this is very different in the Platonic notion of the ideas and the cave, the allegory of the cave, or in the Confucian notion of a Tao, versus the kind of monotheistic notion of a transcendent God. But the notion is that somehow in the axial revolutions you have a structure of a dualism of the mundane order and a transcendent order which is that is used to evaluate. Now, if we understand secular modernity as the particular process of transformation of a version of an axial civilization, and then which is precisely has this characterization of having defined reality in terms of the religion and the secular. So the secular was a religious category within Christian theology, but then the secular becomes the dominating category that then shapes religion. But this is a process which is an internal transformation of a particular Christian Western civilization, but then becomes globalized through colonial globalization. So the question is, how does this model of relating the spheres, the transcendent mundane order, to which extent the modern secular modernity means, to put it in Charles Taylor's terms, the emergence of an immanent frame without transcendence, and to which extent this is globalized and then encounters already pre-existing ways of organizing these relations, and which kind of dynamics of transformation then occur. So the multiple modernities, I think should not be understood as the West being secular and the rest not being secular. But the Western secular modernity itself is a form of a post-Christian and very much intricated with particular Christian transformations. So the other modernities will be post-Hindu, post-Confucian, post-Muslim, in the sense that both, it will be continuities and discontinuities, but it will be shaped by a dynamic which is global, which emerges out of the West because it originates here, but then the process of transformation is one of transformation of traditions, not of a modernity against tradition. This is the way in which we understood the relation. There was tradition, then modernity replaces tradition. Yes, there is a tradition of modernity, but this tradition of modernity is very much shaped by the pre-modern tradition. And this is happening everywhere, I think.
Charles Taylor has spoken in at least one of his articles about kind of our cultural elements of modernization, and then what he described, I think somewhat plausibly, but idiosyncratically maybe, cultural elements of globalization, where notions of modernity, where notions of the self, of society, of nature, and of the good are on the cultural side, and then there are those acultural processes. And these two combined together somehow give a particular flavor of specific modernities. How would you parse out what's common in multiple modernities and what's specifically different?
Well, I think that if I may, the way I understand Charles Taylor's idea here is very much linked to the notion of the axial revolution, is the beginning of a process of disembedding of the self from a structure in which cosmos meaning nature, society, and the self are all, and the gods, the natural, the supernatural, all of them are in one immanent frame. The sacred and the profane were all immanent before the emergence of axial transcendence. And part of this axial transcendence is the beginning of disembedding of the self from society, the emergence of the self. And so the emergence of the self is a key component in this process. But this then becomes radicalized through the transformation of precisely mother individual self, what he calls the buffer self, that he has analyzed so well. So the question is then, you have an immanent frame of, let's say, a cosmos that we understand in terms of the universe, scientific conception of the universe, a conception of society which is based on these horizontal systems of relations of people coming together for mutual benefit, states, markets, public spheres, and then the notion of buffer selves. But then, of course, you have still the existence of these traditions, axial and pre-axial, of how these things are interrelated. So the interesting question is how this immanent frame itself then becomes the frame within which individuals have to transform their identities. So for me, the interesting question is why the same immanent frame in Europe and the United States creates very different possibilities for either theistic belief or non-theistic belief. Let's say, as he puts it, in Europe, to believe in God today becomes almost a very difficult option, while unbelief becomes the taken for granted, the easy solution. But in the United States, this is not the case. The theistic option is the normal option, and the other becomes the minoritarian option. So the question is how within the same immanent frame, still very different possibilities of relationship of the self to something else which is transcendence or not. And I think that here the question is, what is the way in which this immanent frame becomes globalized? Because there is a globalization of all these structures. Science and technology is being globalized. The same kind of model for everybody.
Market economy.
Market economy, the state as a system, and also a certain public sphere through media and so on. But then precisely how this is integrated in conceptions of the good, the issue of even the public sphere. How is the public sphere related to different forms of democracy and to different conceptions of the self, to discursive traditions of what is the common good, justice, how individuals relate to others, the kind of interactive kind of connectivity linked to precisely theories of the public good, of justice, of how to be a good self.
Is that what you meant in once when you made a distinction between kind of structural socioeconomic processes versus something like broadly construed, I take it, regimes of knowledge and of reading the reality, or would that distinction
the
be
regime
somewhat
of
different?
knowledge, I use it because I'm more and more convinced. You know, the old theory of secularization was a kind of a metaphysical theory. Somehow modernization somehow produces secularization, but it's not clear how this happened. And as if it would be just automatic, no carriers, no actors, no agents, and no structures of how this is reproduced. And I'm more and more convinced that there is a knowledge regime of secularism that shapes our imaginary. And I see it in Europe. Look, you ask, we know that people lie to the pollsters. In America, you ask them how religious they are, and they lie, and they say they are more religious than they truly are. They say they pray more frequently than they do, that they go to church more frequently than they do. So there is a sense in which they believe that they ought to be religious, but they know they are not as religious as they ought to be. So the question, the expectation is that Americans, good modern Americans, and Americans want to be modern, but they want to be modern and want to be religious. And so they feel that they are not as religious as they ought to be, so they lie. In Europe, it's the other way around. They want to be modern, but to be modern means to be secular. So if you ask them how religious they are, the normal response is, God forbid, of course I am not religious. I'm a secular, modern, enlightened European. What do you think? And I noticed in Spain, the new surveys, that people, when you ask them how frequently they go to church, how much they believe in God, you have different numbers, much lower than America. But when you ask them how religious they are, they all think, no, I'm not religious at all. So even people that basically go to church frequently and pray frequently, they find themselves as not religious. Because somehow it's not a good thing. So these very different definitions of the situation is what I would call the knowledge regime of secularism in Europe, in which secularism becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. In Europe, once you define modernity as secular, and people want to be modern, then they want to be secular. So there is a certain of conversion to secularity on the part of Europeans, because they want to be modern.
So in a sense, what I'm hearing from you, for a while in various disciplines, religion seemed to be something to be explained, and secularism seemed like a rational default position. What you're suggesting, if I'm hearing you rightly, is that secularism itself also may need to be explained in various ways.
It was Talal Assad, the first one who probably about 8-9 years ago made the proposition, we need an anthropology of secularism rather than anthropology of religion today. This is what we need to do. And that's true. I'm a comparative, I mean, he's more a kind of a genealogical model of social science. My model is comparative historical. So for me the interesting question is, okay, we talk of secularism in the singular, but look, French secularism is very different from other European secularism, and very different from the American, very different from the Turkish, from Indian, from Chinese. So rather than talk of secularism, let's do serious comparative historical analysis of secularism in terms of conceptions of a secular state vis-a-vis religion and society, because even in terms of the secular state, a secular state and the secularism has two components. One, the part of separation of the state from religion and how much establishment, disestablishment, which kind of wall of separation exists there. But the other is the kind of model of exercise of religion. How free is the exercise of religion? How pluralistic? How much is it managed by the state? How much is a self-developed civil society model? So here it's not only that you have different models of separation of church and state, you have very different models of state management of religion in society. And so we need to precisely study how those things work out as process of modernization precisely in different places.
One of the things that you've drawn attention to was, it seems when you put it, very natural one, and namely, if it is true that religions continue to be vibrant in the world today, then maybe we need to shift the attention of what we study from kind of possible decline of religions and why decline, why not, to the kind of transformations of religions and religions that are undergoing major transformations in the globalization situation. Can you comment about types of transformations that are happening? I know it's a huge question, but I think it's a very important one.
Of course, the first model of transformation was, of course, Protestant Christianity. Protestant Christianity, in this respect, is the first modern religion. And so precisely because Protestant Christianity was the model of how a religion is transformed in modernity, it became also the parameter of how other religions were going to be transformed. And then when it becomes the model, which is basically that of an individualized, privatized religion to some extent, not fully, because in different contexts it's different. In the United States it's never a privatized religion. But it's a particular model. Then obviously the Catholic Church resisted very much this model and wanted to remain a public religion, but a public meant then tied to the state. So for me the interesting question is to analyze the Catholic aggiornamento and how the Catholic finally made an attempt to be both modern and public while maintaining its identity with the tradition, redefining the tradition. So the whole issue of continuities and discontinuities in the tradition and how the traditions are reformulated in the context of this encounter with whatever we call secular modernity. And I guess this was the experience of the Catholic transformation linked to Vatican II that opened up for me the eyes. Well, maybe there's the thing, there was a Protestant model of transformation, there is a Catholic model of transformation. I'm sure there will be a Muslim model of transformation. But of course the Catholic is one which is very much, because a hierarchical structure, organized, very fast, very quick, and almost without contestation. The transformation, in 20 years, radical transformation of Catholic societies in this respect. In the Muslim one, there is no hierarchy, there is no clear defined authority, so it goes in all kinds of opposite directions. So you have both feminist and extremely anti-feminist forms of Islam. You have pacifist and extremely violent forms of Islam. And so you have the Muslim transformation going in multiple directions. And the same thing with Hinduism. Hinduism being transformed, you could say, being, for the first time, being constructed by the process of globalization and modernization and the colonial encounter with Christianity and with science and colonialism. And so most of these transformations themselves, even the Western ones, were always related to this encounter with non-Western cultures and religions. And so we simply have to open up to see how part of the crucial component of transformation today is the global dynamics of religions responding to one another and being influenced by one another as much as they are influenced by their own tradition. So today, to understand the transformations, the relationship to their own tradition is very important, but also the way in which they define themselves vis-a-vis other religions. So Hinduism defines itself vis-a-vis Islam and vis-a-vis Christianity. Islam defines itself vis-a-vis Judaism, vis-a-vis Christianity, and so on. So you have, and in different contexts, this relationship is different.
And they don't need to be necessarily oppositional. There's all sorts of borrowing that's going on back and forth, as well as negotiating boundaries positively and negatively.
Indeed, I would think that the boundaries were never so clear-cut probably in pre-modern times. Then there is an attempt to purify boundaries today. It's part of the process of modernization, but this becomes also problematic. I think there is a dynamic tension between each religion defining its particular uniqueness vis-a-vis other religions, at the same time presenting themselves as the universal solution for global humanity. So you have a dynamic both of particularism and universalism going on within each religious tradition. And sometimes the emphasis is on the uniqueness, the particularity, and the separation, therefore, from the others. At other moments, the moment is the universalism and how universalism that we all share and how we can get together and see how our universalisms are all particularistic and our particularisms are ways of that can be somehow connected with a universalism also. So,
and I take it that they're also partly negotiating their identity, both in terms of going back to the heart of their own tradition, and also to watching what happens at the boundaries.
Right.
And if you have simply boundary maintenance and watching the boundaries, you will have a positional definition of identities. Right. But if the religions define themselves from the center, in part, I think possibilities emerge of exchanges and borrowings and so forth.
And there is, first, these redefinitions, of course, very selective. Today, obviously, there was a time when nobody would have used the category Judeo-Christian. Because nobody before World War II ever used the category. Now everybody talks it as a normal thing because realize how those boundaries are not so clear and there is a common tradition. Yeah. We began talking of Abrahamic traditions, religions, right? And then September 11 made the category problematic, and so some people want to completely separate Judeo-Christian, yes, but not Islam, East, West. So those categories are problematic. Islam is as much part of the West as of the Orient in this respect. And then the more you realize that even the transformations of these traditions in their golden ages of medieval Christianity, medieval Christendom, medieval Judaism, all three of them are so interconnected with the reception of Hellenism and Aristotle and how much they share the same theological language and discourse, let's say, at this time, and how much. So it's what they see as almost their core from which they draw happens to be a core which is almost shared by the three religions. So it's not only the original book and Bible and the notion of the same Yahweh, God that they share, but also kind of the golden age of the tradition from which they define themselves is also one which was very much in dynamic relation to one another in the Middle Ages.
And we've talked now about the self-definition of religions in interaction with one another. There's also self-definition that's going on in interaction with kind of globalization processes, kind of deterritorialization tendencies of globalization processes, kind of democratization tendencies of globalization processes, and others as well. How are religions negotiating their identity with regard to these kinds of processes?
Well, there's a constant dynamic relationship. Of course, if you have, let's say, either is what I call a knowledge regime of secularism that defines modernity as one in which there is no room for religion in the public sphere, then you are going to have religion that say, no, but you are asking us to basically dissolve and disappear and to lose our identity. To tell that Judaism can become a purely private religion or that Islam can become a private religion is basically to deny their identity. So it's a also dynamic relationship between secularist conceptions of what the global order ought to be and religion's responses to it. I think we are now, when somebody even like, let's say, a thinker like Habermas, who I think is a very, very kind of typically paradigmatic European thinker, very much alert to the Geist, to the Geist of the spirit of the times, then talks of post-secular Europe, and basically because he realizes that this moment in which the secular define the place of religion, basically we have to rethink those issues, and that we are in a moment right now that whatever we call global order, globalization, will have to be somehow constructed jointly through a process of communication through all kinds of different traditions, secular and religious. So I think that we are in a moment of dynamic, both tensions, but also conflicts, therefore. If conflicts can be, to a certain extent, I wouldn't say contained, but regulated within bounds, then obviously they can be very productive. I mean, that's what politics is, right? So the question is, how do we allow for all these tensions and conflicts to happen in a way in which we allow for these conflicts to happen so they don't have to become violent?
So some people suggest, well, likelihood within the context of globalization processes of democratized religions to succeed is higher than authoritarian religions. On the other hand, somebody like Peter Berger has suggested, well, most of the religions that are growing precisely by defining themselves in opposition to at least some elements of globalization processes. How do you see this dynamic of adaptation as well as of resistance to particular...
The question is here, the category of democracy is problematic, because when we talk of democracy, we talk usually of two different things, of liberty and equality. I mean, this was Tocqueville. Tocqueville probably was the only true modern social scientist that got it right here, in the sense that he realized that the more democratization, the more religion is going to be central to politics. Because he understood democratization primarily in terms of equalization of conditions and the incorporation of the masses into politics. And his elites may be non-religious, and he thought of the Enlightenment, but the masses, even then in Europe, he thought ordinary people are religious. So when ordinary people enter politics, they bring their religion with them. So the question is, for instance, I think that there is no question that Islam is a very democratic religion in the sense of Tocquevillian sense of equality of conditions, but it's not a liberal religion. So liberalism and democracy here are two things. We tend to see today liberalism and democracy as being the same. But in the 19th century, liberals were not democratic and Democrats were non-liberal. And so part of the debate is the relationship between democracy and liberalism. And so the question, the relation between equality and liberty. So this is, and then how these, the same thing, and many of these fundamentalisms are very democratic, they are mass democratic, but the question is then the protection of minority rights. That's why for Tocqueville, the question of democracy was the question of the tyranny of the majority. And so this is the real question, how we construct structures in which these majoritarian religious movements can allow for the liberties of minorities, other religious and secular minorities. Or vice versa, when you have secular majorities, how do you allow for really the possibilities of religious minorities to participate in public life? So, and that's why the category of separation of church and state is not, because when you have ecclesiastical institutions, you can separate ecclesiastical institutions from states, from administrative states, but you cannot separate religion and politics. When you have religious citizens, to separate religion and politics means to disenfranchise religious people. So you cannot tell religious people, you cannot bring your religion into the public sphere. So the question is then, how do you do it in a way that you protect the rights of minorities, both secular and religious? And so this is the fundamental question, the relationship between democracy as equality and democracy as liberty or liberalism. And I think this, Tocqueville was the one who really saw this as the fundamental problem of modernity. And this remains within the context of religions also, the relation between a kind of centralized majoritarian consensus and the possibility of heresy within, and apostasy. And those are the fundamental issues.
And those are the issues, I think, that are before us, especially as the world democratizes and liberal democracy presumably takes hold in various settings. What will happen with various religious actors in a pluralistic setting in that kind of a situation?
Right. But even democracies, we tend to think of democracies as one thing. Electoral democracy, there are certain things with democracies share in terms of institutional structures, some division of powers, but then you have different presidentialist versus parliamentary democracies. The point is, American democracy and French democracy, and those are the two kind of paradigmatic modern democratic revolutions, are very different. And then you have British is again different from the French and the American. Indian democracy, it's the largest democratic country in the world. It's very different from our democracies. Democracy was not supposed to be viable in a country like India with hundreds of religions, hundreds of languages, hundreds of ethnic groups, and yet it's a very vibrant democracy with a lot of problems, but they are really somehow being able to handle in these problems. And I assume Chinese democracy, when we can talk of democracy, will be very different from our democracy. Even when, so it would not be liberal democracy in our sense. I'm not sure that we can talk of liberal democracy in India in our sense, even in the sense that they accept plurality of legal structures for different groups. So they have responded and have structured their own democracy. So it's a reinvention of democracy. It's not simply that the British gave them a model. They reinvented democracy for Indian context. And I think that this process going on. Indonesia has developed its own model of democracy, which is also very interesting. So
not just multiple modernities, but multiple forms of democracies, depending on cultural as well as other religious
and
other
we
traditions.
think of capitalism as one single model, but again, if we think of Chinese capitalism, is very different from the capitalisms with even American capitalism and European. We all the time there is a lot of,
especially now as we're talking, there's a big debate about how different these two are.
If we take the model of what Max Weber called modern rational capitalism, then Chinese capitalism is not modern. It's state capitalism, it's kinship capitalism, and it's gambling. Combination of the three. But it works. It works, and it's very good.
Maybe for the end of our conversation, we have started with the sense of secularism, secularization thesis not quite being as persuasive as some people have expected it to be. Presumption there was there a certain resurgence of religion, and there is. And the question, I suppose, is why? What functions do religions play in people's lives? Why do people continue to be religious in contemporary world?
Well, we have difficulties because we use the same categories for different things. Even religion, we are not sure what religion, whether we can have one single thing that we call religion that covers across it. It's very hard to find a definition of religion shared by everybody. I mean, in my own discipline,
like family resemblance, and even that may be too loose, right?
No, but in my own discipline, the two great fathers of the discipline, Durkheim and Max Weber, had very different theories of religion. Their focus is very different. Durkheim is the religion as the social, having to do with the collective identity, how religion serves to integrate the community, how religion serves basically to share the same way of thinking, the same way of acting, while Weber is much more interested in religion as these kind of paths of salvation to individuals, which then enter in conflicts with the rest of society and the tensions between the world and society. So there are two very different conceptions of what religion does and what their functions. I think that both are right, and therefore we have to integrate the two, at least the aspect of religion as a function for individuals, but then these individuals form communities, which are religious communities, which are defined in religious communal terms. And then the question is, when do these religious communities are in tune and in sync with also the socio-political communities, and when they are in conflict and in tension? So, and this is part of the whole transnational global context today. One of the questions is, in a global context, we have to develop new identities, a national identity. There are too many nations in the world to be the way in which people define their identities. It worked for the Olympics and so on, but you have these transnational structures that were there before the nation state that have re-emerged. And this is what, in this respect, Huntington is right about the relevance of civilizations. But he sees civilizations as geopolitical territorial units clashing with one another. But the interesting question today is how these what I call global denominations, because it is a process of global denominationalism going on, calling each other, I'm a Confucian, I'm a Hindu, I'm a Muslim. But this is not anymore linked to territories, so that through transnational migrations, through global processes of media and communications and ideas, then you have the freeing of individuals from communities, communities from territories, societies. So you have locals, national, global dynamics, transnational dynamics all at once. And these you have a need for redefinition of identities, and religion has been one of the ways of defining collective identities. but also issues ultimately of transcendence still remain. The immanent frame is not so much a crisis of secular modernity per se, and therefore religion as a response to it, but there is something to it. There is something that the promise of a progressive utopian secular modernity as a kind of secular religion has lost the appeal it had. So these all modern ideologies that promise salvation here on earth, in a way in which all utopian ideologies were, whether socialist or fascist, or there is a crisis of these secular ideologies. So it allows again for new types of redefinitions of precisely the relation of the self, society, and the cosmos, which all these ideologies also did. I mean, they somehow, at least the self and society. So you have, I think, both a crisis of secular modernity as a utopian ideology, which is a kind of a secular religion, and then you have the redefinition of collective identities under context of globalization. So this is one of the reasons. And of course, this can happen where these global identities then clash with one another or become complementary as a form of global denominationalism, like in the United States, where you have all kinds of religious communities which maintain their claims to be the true religion while accepting that my neighbors have a different denomination and somehow we all can be American. So there is a sense in which we are in the process of formation of a global structure in which we all will recognize that we have different religious names, different denominations, but we all have also claims to be universal in our own way. And we'll just have to learn to live with one another somehow.
Yeah, on this note of hope for learning how to live with one another as we embrace overarching interpretations of life that are very much also particular, we can end this very fruitful and very stimulating conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you.